Okay. So once again, we will start with activity-based costing. Now, before we start with activity-based costing, just as a recap to what we did on Thursday, okay? Now, we are going to take a similar question on how traditional costing works, okay? And this came on November 2016, ICAG, Management Accounting. Okay, so let's look at this question. What is the requirement? It says that required, we are supposed to calculate overhead absorption rate for each department for the year ended 30th September 2015. We are supposed to determine the total cost and the price of job CA2, right? That's job costing. So using traditional costing, I think I told you that we are going to find our OAR, our overhead absorption rate. And you can see from here that we have our overheads, we have direct labor hours, we have direct machine hours. If you look at the department assembly, you have overhead cost and then direct machine hours. When you look here, we have what welding, but it has what direct machine hours. When it comes to finishing, it uses labor hours, but then when it comes to direct machine hours, there's nothing there. Now, some questions can be given like this, right? Where all of them have machine hours and they have labor hours. If you want to absorb, you look at what the person uses more of. Do you get it? That's what you use to absorb, because you look at the one you are more intensive. Are you labor intensive or you are machine intensive? Do you get what I'm trying to put across? So assuming this one, we have 14,400 for labor, right? And we have 12,000 machine hours. It means that when you're absorbing and the question is quiet, you are going to use 14,400 because he uses more labor hours. Here, assuming there was labor hours and labor hours was 3,000. Then are we going to use machine hours or we are going to use labor hours for welding? Which one will we use? Assuming the question was silent. Which one are we going to use? You can write it in the chat section for me, or you can raise your hand and I'll call you so that you unmute, because the noise on the background is too much. Or you can equally unmute. You can equally unmute and answer. Just put up your hand nicely. Yes. So you look at what the person uses more of, and then you are going to use that to absorb. Do you get it? That is how that works. So with this being said, I think now you get the whole thing. Now, when you get such questions, my first step is try to get my overhead absorption rate. Okay, so I told you the formula for overhead absorption rate comes with a lot of maths. Don't ever the exam, make sure you always get what the overhead absorption rate. So our overhead absorption rate is giving us our total what budgeted overheads, our total budgeted overheads over our total budgeted what absorption basis, right? For activity absorption activity. And yeah, absorption basis is either what machine hours. You're absorbing based on machine hours, or we are basing on what labor what hours, right? That's what we are using in this question. So the very first thing is that I want to get the OAR, the overhead absorption rate for assembly, right? So let me get assembly department OAR. Okay, and that gives me the total overheads in assembly over the total what machine hours I have for assembly. So the total overheads was 64,050 all over machine hours of what 5 to 50 machine hours, right? Okay, and that gives us how much? I want someone to calculate and give me the figures. Just one person. Okay, so that it wouldn't be like everyone is talking. So we have, you can actually unmute 64050 over 5250. And that gives us 12 CD20 pesos per machine hour, not simple, per machine hour. So for every machine hour used in the assembly department, if overhead was a person, we'll pay him 12 CD 12 CD 20 pesos, right? Just like we pay labor rate. This is the rate at which we are going to incur overhead costs. Then we do the same for welding. It seems welding was also machine intensive, right? So our welding department OAR, we are going to incur cost of what? 108,900 for all the jobs, right? All the jobs use 6,600 what? Hours, machine hours in the organization, right? But here lies the case. We want for one job so that we can use it to cost job CA2. One zero eight nine hundred divided by 16 CDs, 50 pesos per hour, per machine hour. Okay, so we have done the 16 CDs, 50 pesos per machine hour. Now we come to the last department, which was labor intensive. So that was what finishing. And the finishing department OAR, I think finishing department incurred the cost of 83,520, was 520, not so. All over total labor hours of 14,400, not so. This was labor hours. So this one, I think it gave us 83,520 divided by 14,4, right? And that gave us 5 CDs, 80 pesos per labor hour. Not so. Okay. So now that is done. Now that we have the OAR, the next thing is to absorb into the product in question. Now, what job are we costing for? We are costing for job CA2, right? So we need our job card or our cost card for what? Our cost card for job CA2. That's nicely done. So let's get all the details for job CA2. I prefer we work in total, then we go and get the per unit. So first of all, we need direct materials. So direct materials, actually you can see that direct materials, it has some opening stock and it has some purchases during the year. So looking at direct materials, they said what? We had direct material from stores. That means it's opening stock. We went to break them from stores and the one that you bought in this year, okay, or this period. So we had opening stock and then purchases for the year. So from stores, how much material was from stores? We have 16,500 from stores, not so. And then we bought additional what? Bought additional 12,000 what? 600. Okay, so materials, we have 16,500 plus 12,600, 16,500 plus 12,600. And that is 29,100. Okay, so that is it for material. Then we go to direct labor. So the labor also must what? We pay them a particular what rate based on the hours that they work. So direct labor, I believe assembly department, not so. We can see from there, from here, that assembly department, they work 450 hours, we pay them 8 per hour. These people work 535 hours, we pay them 8 per hour. But you see, because finishing was more labor intensive, you can see that finishing, they use out of the 14,4, they use 1,235 hours, right? For only this job, with this job CA2. But other jobs account for the rest of the 14,4. Do you get the idea? So assembly was using what? 450 hours, labor hours, and we are paying them 8 CDs, those in assembly, right? Those in welding were using what? 535 labor hours. We are also paying them 8 CDs. Then those in finishing worked 1,235 labor hours, but we are paying them what? 6 CDs per hour. So you see labor of different grades here. So 450 at 8, these guys end up with 3,600. You have 535 at 8, end up with what? 4,280. Then we have 1,235 at 6 CDs. We end up paying them 7,400 and what? And 10, right? Now, if we put it together, we have 3,600 plus 4,280 plus 7,410. Not so. We have 15,200 and what? And 90. Okay, so we now have our labor cost. Now, I think we need our production what overheads. Now, if you see, we have trial and testing cost is incurred in each job, and this is a specific job. So my question is, this cost, is it related to job CA2 alone and each and every job? Yes. So it can be directly traced to the making or the creation of one job, making it a direct cost, right? Because if I take every job, I can tell how much of this trial and testing cost is inside. So that means that we have a direct expense, right? So under direct expenses, we have what? Trial and testing costs, right? So under direct expenses, we have trial and testing. So under trial and testing, I would end up with what? 5,400 for each job, right? And we are doing one single job, so we incur a cost of what? 5,400. So if I should put together this, all the direct costs sum up to what? Our prime cost. So adding this together means that this is our prime cost, right? So let's add everything together. So we have 29,100 plus 15,290 plus 5,400. And that gives us 49,790. Okay. Now that is our prime cost. Now we need our production overhead. So I come here and say what? Production overheads. Now production overheads, I think we had already computed it, right? Okay, the OAR. This is our OAR, which was per times the number of hours, right? The number of hours. Okay. So now we already have our OAR for each of the departments. We just have to go up and pick them. So when it comes to overhead, assembly, people in assembly get paid how much? So if overhead were a person, in assembly would have been paid 12 cedis, 20 pesos per machine hour, right? Per machine hour. But how many machine hours were used in assembly? You go to the question and you see that when it comes to machine hours, assembly uses 425. Welding uses 532. Labor, finishing has none. It actually uses what? Labor hours. You can see. So in that case, I come here. This guy, 12 CD, 20 pesos. He uses what? 425 machine hours, right? Because it's per machine hour, it should end the machine hours, right? So it uses 425 machine hours. When it comes to welding, right? How much was welding? I think welding was 16 CDs, 50 pesos per machine hour, right? So how many machine hours did we use for welding? That's 532 machine hours, not so?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Then we come to what? Finishing also. Okay. I believe finishing was what? 5 CD, 80 pesos per labor hour, right? That was labor hour. So how many labor hours were used in finishing? We check it here is what? 1, 2, 3, 5 labor hours. Not so. Okay. So now that this is done, what we are going to do is just multiply each in 12.2 by 425. And that means this one we incur a cost of 5,185. And we have 16.5 by 532. And that gives us 8,778. And we have 5.8 by 1,235. And that gives us 7,163. No, so we put all together 5,185 plus 8,778 plus 7,163. We end up with 21,126. Now, so now if we put this together, we are going to get our total product cost, right? Because there was no non-production cost. So we get our total product cost. That gives us 49,700 plus 21,126. We end up with 70,916, right? And then this one goes forward to tell us that it is the policy of the company to make 50% profit on each job, markup, okay? So I will take this small time to teach you guys markup and margin, right? Markup and margin are nothing new because in management accounting, these are techniques and tools we work with. you must understand the nature of what we call markup and margin, right? So pay close attention because almost pricing, this that you will get to the question on pricing. So nature of markup and margins, right? Markup and margin. Now, markup and margins are just mere profit percentages. What did I say? They are what?
Mere profit percentage.
Yeah, so markup and margin is a profit percentage. Now, when you represent your profit in percentage terms, it can either take the form of a markup or margin. Okay, we all know the profit equation, saying that what? Profit is equal to what? Sales minus what? Minus cost, right?
Mhm.
That is if you are going to total. So our profit per unit is equal to what? Our selling price minus what? Our, our cost price, right? Okay. So in simple terms, that means what? Our selling price will be equal to cost plus what? Cost plus profit. True or false? Now, if you put this in percentage terms, this profit in percentage terms can either be what? A markup, or it can either be what? A margin. Is that okay? So a markup means that it is a markup on cost plus something, okay? So markup, cost is equivalent to 100%, okay? Cost is 100%. Margin means that selling price is the base. So selling price or sales is equivalent to what? 100%. Is that okay? Have this in mind. So anytime you get a markup or a margin, that means they are computing it on either cost or they are computing it on selling price. Do you get the idea? So we are going to take some simple illustrations before we come back to this question so that you understand. So anytime you hear markup, so assuming they tell you that a company, right? I want to use real example. A company has cost of sales, right? Cost of sales of 500,000, right?
Mhm.
It has opening stock, right, of 150,000, right? And then it leaves, okay, the company leaves 60% of opening stock as carried stock to the next year or to the next period, right? So determine the purchases. Are you writing? Determine the purchases of the company if it makes a markup, if it makes a markup of 30% and extracts the income statement, right? And extract the income statement. Non-production costs, that is selling and admin, is 40% of cost of sales. Okay, just put this question down. I just want us to do real illustrations, right? On markup and margin. Okay. So with markup and margin, anytime you hear markup and margin, when it is markup, I told you what is 100% in markup. If you hear markup, what is 100%? Is it cost or selling price?
Cost.
Cost. In that case, when you hear markup, you say cost equals 100, right? So when I put down my profit percentage, cost plus profit equals selling price, my equation, cost will be 100, right? Since the company makes a markup of 30%, that means 100 plus 30, that means selling price should be equivalent to 130. True or false?
Yeah.
True, right? So if I know this, then I know that this cost, which is 100%, was equivalent to my cost of sales, which was 100 and what? Cost of sales was 500,000 also. True or false? Look in the question. It says the company has cost of sales of 500. That is cost, right? And if cost of sales is equivalent to 500,000, profit is 30, this is 130. We can use ratio analysis to get the missing figure. So you are saying that if 500,000 was equivalent to what? 100%, true or false? Then if I want the profit, this one was cost of sales. Then if I want the gross profit, not so, it will be equivalent to what percentage? Is it not 30%? So this 30, we don't know its monetary equivalent, do we? We don't, right? So will it be less or more? It will be less. So if less, more divide, right? So that means if I want my gross profit percentage, it will become what? 30 out of the 100 times the 500,000 cost. Do you guys get it? Is it clear to everyone? So 30 out of 100 times 500,000. So this ratio is not the same throughout. You can even decide to get your selling price, right? That means that the gross profit becomes 150,000. The same way, if I want sales, sales is equivalent to 130, right? I can take 130 out of this, can take one. It doesn't matter how you do it. For instance, if I want sales, I can say, okay, if this is 100, selling price was 130. So this will be what? It will be more, right? So if more, less divide. I can do 130 out of the 100 times the 500,000. Not so. Do you guys get what I'm trying to put across? That means
Yes,
that I
yes.
650,000 as my selling price. Do you get it? Yeah, so it doesn't really matter. You can even take it out of the profit percentage that if now I know that my profit, which is equivalent to 30%, was equivalent to 150,000 also, then my cost, which is 100%, will be what? I don't know, right? If I put it there, I can still get it. That cost becomes 100 out of 30 times 100 and what? 50,000. So this goes into 85. You still end up with 500,000 to be the cost. True or false? True. And it is true. The cost of sales was actually 500,000. You guys get the idea. So now they said we should extract the income statement. So here lies the case. If I should put down what my sales, now I know my sales. I already know sales now to be what? 650,000 also. Now I less what? Cost of sales. Cost of sales. So my cost of sales, I have what? Opening stock, right? Which the company says they leave what? They have opening stock of 100 and what? 50,000. Okay. Then we add purchases. Purchases is what we are looking for not so. So I can make here the balancing figure. Then I less what? I'm supposed to less closing stock, not so. No be so. Now, if you read the question I gave, there's mini question. It says what? The company leaves 60% of opening stock as carry stock to the next period. Then we know stock for the next period is always the closing stock, right? So we take 60% of this 150,000 that we have here as a carry forward stock for the next period. No, so zero point 0.6 times 150,000. That means we have closing stock of 90,000, right? Now, if we deduct our closing stock, we end up with our cost of sale, not so. And when you read the question, it says the cost of sale is how much? How much was the cost of sales? When we read the question, how much was the cost of sales? How much was the cost of sales?
500,000. 500,000.
So we are saying that, okay, if we put everything together, here is what? 500,000, leaving us with a gross profit of how much?
150.
150, okay. So we are saying that 150 plus something plus box minus 90 gives us 500. True or false? So we can work back to get what this balancing figure is, which becomes the purchases. True or false? So this is a game of missing figures. Management accountant likes it a lot. And why I'm teaching you this is when we get to budgeting, this is what we'll be doing, right? Budgeting is all about missing figures. And this is how you get the purchases budget, right? You need to understand markup and margin. Do you understand? And when you get it, well, trust me, cash budgets and then master budget will be a sure banker for you all the time. You get the idea. So now what do we do? So you are just saying that cost of sales is equal to what? Your opening stock plus purchases, not so minus closing stock, right? Now we know this was 500. this was 150 plus what? Box. No, so which is the purchases minus closing stock of 90. So how do we make box the subject? If box is left alone, you have 500 plus 90 minus 150, right? Giving us this box. True or false? Is that not so? If you are working back, it means that you are taking this 500, adding back what you deducted and deducting what you added. So it means that 500 plus 90 minus 150. Do you understand? Do you get it? And what do you get for the purchases? It becomes a balancing figure. That means our purchases figure becomes what? 400 and what? 40,000.
440.
That is how you work this back, right? So that was a bit about markup. Now you hear markup, cost is 100, right? What about a margin, right? So AML Limited, right, sells a fruit drink, right? They sell a fruit drink with cost of 600,000, right? It uses a markup of 25% on all sales, right? On all sales. Determine the cost, no, the selling price or the sales for the product, and B, the profit, right? So simple. Because this is margin, what is 100%? Margin, what becomes 100%?
Selling price.
The selling price.
So you are saying selling price should be equivalent to 100. So if we put cost plus profit equals selling price, because this is margin, this is 100, right? And we know it makes markup margin of 25. So here becomes 25. So you are saying box plus 25 equals what? 100. What is box? Primary school maths, right? So that means box should be equivalent to 75, not so. So that means this 600%, 600,000 cost is equivalent to what? 75%, right? So we are finding this, which we don't know, right? We don't know this one. So in that case, if 75 was equivalent to 600,000, not so, then 100 will be what? We don't know, but it will be more, right? If more, let's divide. So our selling price or our sales becomes 100 out of 75 times that 600,000, right? And that gives us what? 800,000, right? So if I now want my profits, okay, I can still take the profit percentage and use it to get a profit. So our profit was 25% margin out of the sales, which is 100 of 800, or you can use the 75, which is the 600,000, right? Being the cost to give us the profit, and the profit to be 200,000 also. Is it true? Is it true?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so that was about markup and margin. I hope everybody is fine now. Okay. And now all these things, if it was at the lower level, they'll come as questions on their own. But at your level, they will be mixed up in a question. So you can see that it says trials and testing cost 5.4. We've done that. It is the company's policy to make markup of what? Markup of what?
50%.
50%.
So if markup, it means that cost is equivalent to what? 100%, Meboa. So if cost is equivalent to 100%, then the profit is equivalent to what percentage? Profit is what? 50% on the cost, true or false? So I can easily find it and say, okay, then profit will be 50 out of this 100. Do you all agree? Times the 7916, right? Because you are saying that if the cost, which is 7916, is equivalent to what? 100%, then our profit, which is equivalent to 50%, will be equivalent to what? It will be less. So if less, more divide. So you see the more, which is 100, is divided times this. So we can easily get our profit and add it to get our selling price of the job. Do you get it? 50 out of 100 times 7916. And that gives us what? 35,400 and what? 58. You can add it up to get selling price because cost plus profit equals what? Our selling price, right? And what's the selling price of job CA2? What do we get?
406,374.
106,374, right? The same way I could have equally says this is what? The same as the 100 and what? 50 out of what? The 100 times 7916, and we end up with the same thing, right? I hope that is okay with everyone. So that was just a bit of revision and introduction to markup and margin. I hope everybody's on point. It's question time before we now move from traditional costing to activity-based costing. Yes, question time. Please ask your questions and let's move. We don't have time at all. I think we've wasted all the time on revision. Please, I'm waiting for your questions here. Since no one has a question, let's dive into activity-based costing. Now, you see how we're doing the traditional costing, where we do OAR. The OAR was either based on machine hours or labor hours, or a percentage of prime cost or units produced or something, right? Now, that is not bad, but as manufacturing systems got more advanced, people are now using robots, analytics, right? A complex manufacturing environment. You don't expect your rent and all other costs together, all your indirect costs, to be based on machine hours or labor hours alone, right? Because each activity now are based on some things drive those costs. Do you understand? So activity-based costing is actually a costing method that has been developed to deal with the perceived weakness of traditional absorption costing. Now, why the perceived weakness of traditional absorption costing? Now, the traditional absorption costing is based on the principle that production overheads are driven by the level of production, which is not necessarily true. In the past, this could have been true, but now this is not true. Okay. And this is reflected in the choice of activity level in the OAR calculation, like unit, labor hours, or machine hours. And these all increase as the level of production increases. And this was true in the past, as I was telling you, because a company only produced one simple product or a few simple and similar products. But now you can see a company which has services, right? Complex services. It also has goods. It also has variations of goods and services. So it's difficult to just use machine hours and what? Labor hours to absorb, right? So we must understand now that the following points will be significant in the modern economies. That overheads used to be a small percentage of your total cost in traditional manufacturing, right? Those times compared to now, right? Some years ago. Now, in addition, production overheads such as machine depreciation will have been a small proportion of your overall cost. And this is because production was more labor intensive, and as a result, direct cost would have been much higher than indirect cost. So a rough estimate of production overhead per unit was therefore fine. Do you guys get the concept? Because your overheads were not that much, we just used guesswork. As I was telling you on Thursday, that okay, based on guesswork, we can say, okay, let's say if we spread that cost on labor hours, at least we can get what? A rough figure. Unlike now, where overheads are a huge chunk. Look at the foam manufacturing industry. A huge chunk of the costs are just overheads instead of direct costs, because now everybody's using machines. Do you get the idea? So it wouldn't be appropriate to now just use labor hours or machine hours to be absorbing. You need a better costing system. Do you understand? Now, overheads are now a larger proportion of total cost in modern manufacturing. So manufacturing has become more machine intensive, and as a result, the proportion of your production overheads compared to your direct cost has increased. Therefore, it is important that an accurate estimate is made of the production overhead per unit. And the nature of manufacturing has changed, right? Many companies now operate in a highly competitive environment. And as a result, the diversity and complexity of products have also increased. Now, this same can also be the weaknesses of traditional costing, right? Compared to the activity-based costing, right? That question can pop up for you too. Now, when you are calculating the full cost of production per unit in ABC, the first thing you have to do is that ABC is activity-based costing, meaning it's a costing system based on activity. And these activities are activities that drive the cost. You can't tell me that if I do deliveries for people, delivery that I do for people will be influenced by labor hours. Will it be influenced by labor hours? No. But what I do if I told you that this cost is driven by the number of deliveries, then will you agree that the more deliveries, the more cost I incur?
Yes.
Yes. So now that is a more appropriate base, right? That is what activity-based costing does. So we are saying that now, as I'm now, when you're doing activity-based costing, there are 5 basic steps. You see, the question can ask you to list the steps to be carried out in activity-based costing. So first of all, group the production overheads into activities according to how they are driven, right? That is putting it into a cost pool. So you determine the cost pool, right? So a cost pool is an activity which consumes resources and for which overheads or overhead costs are identified and allocated. Now, for each cost pool, there should be a cost driver. Like the way I took delivery cost, and then we saw what? The number of deliveries. So the terms activity and cost pool are often used interchangeably. For example, one activity could be quality control, but the activity driver or the cost driver to this quality control may be the number of quality inspections. Do you get it? That is a typical example. Now, after you have been able to pull your costs together, you need to identify the cost drivers for each activity. These steps, you need to write them down. So first of all, get your cost pool or gather your activities. The next thing is to identify the things which drive that cost, right? So a cost driver is simply a factor that influences or drives that level of cost. Okay, for example, we could argue that the cost of quality control is driven by the number of inspections rather than the total number of units that have been produced. Do you understand? So once you have been able to identify the cost drivers, now you calculate the OAR for each activity. And this OAR in ABC is called the cost driver rate. You can still call it OAR. But the only difference between the traditional costing and then the activity-based costing is that under activity-based costing, each activity has its own OAR. Unlike the normal traditional costing we looked at, where everything is absorbed on labor hours or machine hours, this one, if I have 5 activities, in the past, we would have put all together and absorbed using machine hours or labor hours. But now, if I have 3 activities, each activity has its own cost driver. Do you get it? So the overhead absorption rate in ABC is calculated in the same way as the one we did, right? But however, a separate OAR will be calculated for each activity by taking the activity cost and divided by the cost driver information. So for example, we could determine a cost per inspection for quality control cost. So OAR under ABC is known as the cost driver rate and is given as the total cost in the cost pool over the total number of activity drivers or the total number of cost drivers. Then the next step is to absorb the activity cost into the product, right? So the activity cost should be absorbed back into the individual product. For example, if we know how many inspections were made on product X, then we can absorb a corresponding quantity of quality control cost. Then the next thing you have to do is be able to calculate the full production cost per unit or the what? The profit or loss. So just write it in your own simple words, right? In activity-based costing, what are the steps? Okay, this thing is a pure exam question. So steps in ABC, right? They can ask you for 5 marks. What is it? What's the first step? Yes, what do we do? Step 1.
Group your activities.
So group activities, right? So you group activities or you gather your cost pool also. The next thing is to what? Determine what? Cost drivers, right? The third is what? Calculate cost driver rate or calculate OAR for what? For each activity also. Calculate OAR for each activity also. So calculating OAR for each activity, you are saying that that is your A here over your B here. Also, so that's your total cost in the cost pool or total activity cost all over what the number of what drivers, right? The number of costs drivers. Now, what's the next step? You absorb into the product. And then finally, determine your full production cost, right? Are we okay? Are we there? Are we all there? We are not supposed to waste time at all. Let's fight for it. All right. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of ABC? Now, first of all, ABC provides a more accurate cost per unit, right, than traditional costing. As a result, pricing strategy, sales strategy, performance, and decision making will be improved because now costing is more accurate. Two, it provides a much better insight into what drives costs rather than labor hours and machine hours. ABC recognizes that overhead costs are not all related to production and sales volume, right? Like the way we saw for traditional costing. Now, in many businesses today, overhead costs are a significant proportion of total cost, and management needs to understand the drivers of overhead costs in order to manage the business properly. Now, overhead costs can be controlled by managing the cost drivers. So because now you can identify the cost drivers, you can easily manage how the cost drivers work, and then your costs can work. So that one will serve as a cost control mechanism, right? Now, it can be applied to derive realistic costs in a complex business environment, like where you use robots and analytics. It can be applied to all overhead costs, not just production overheads, right? And ABC can be used just as easily in service costing as in product costing, right? Unlike traditional costing. So the advantages of ABC becomes the disadvantages of traditional costing. Do you guys get it now? So let's look at the disadvantages. Now, ABC will be of limited benefit if the overhead costs are primarily volume related, and if the overhead is a small proportion of the overall cost, then there's no need to implement a costing system like ABC. And sometimes it is impossible to allocate all overhead costs to specific activities. Some of them, determining the cost driver may be a very difficult task because some overheads are influenced by a lot of things, right? So determining one of them may be a problem. So the choice of both activity and cost drivers might be inappropriate, right? Because just like we're able to determine delivery cost and its driver, it may be difficult in some circumstances, right? To really know what is influencing that cost. And ABC can be more complex to explain to stakeholders of the costing exercise. The benefits obtained from ABC might not justify the cost because ABC can be expensive when you bring somebody to implement it for you in real life. And other systems may need to be changed. For example, how variances are calculated will now change because now you are using a different costing system rather than what standard costing. Okay, so this is everything you need to know about ABC for the exam. Okay, now we dive into computations. Does that make sense? You see, I'm just on exam focus. So now that we understand ABC, who has a question for me before we start moving to computations? We are just going to solve two solid questions and then we are done with ABC. And every question, we'll do it from the perspective of traditional costing and we'll do it from the perspective of ABC. Is that okay with everyone? Shall we move? Is that okay with everyone? Can we move?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
That is fine. So now, have you put down some advantages and disadvantages in your own words? That I want you to do. Okay. So let's take a simple question here. Very simple question. This one, I think, is just on overhead absorption. Now, a company manufactures two products, product L and product M, using the same equipment and similar processes. This is an extract of their production data for this product in one period, which is shown below. So we have product L and product M, right? So we have all the data we can see. They said calculate the production overheads to be absorbed by 1 unit of each of the products using the following costing methods. Either a traditional approach where we absorb using labor hours or an activity-based costing using suitable cost drivers to trace the overhead to products. Do you get it? So now, somebody is asking for slides. No, this is my management accounting textbook. It's a full textbook, not a slide. I told you the last time I'm updating it. So once it's ready, I'll make it available. I'll tell you the price and everything. And this is the old version. It's called passive management accounting. Now, let's look at it. We are using traditional costing, right? So let's say A, we'll use traditional what? Costing also. So using traditional costing, we first calculate OAR, right? You know our steps, OAR. And we say OAR is what? Always remember this total budgeted what? Overheads, not so our total budgeted overheads over our total budgeted absorption basis, not so. Okay. But here, the absorption basis was what? The question said we should use what? We should use labor hours, not so. Is that not so? So since we are using labor hours as our absorption basis, the first question I want is how many labor hours do we want? Okay. Because we know our total budgeted overheads, we can even find our total budgeted overheads. So what was our total budgeted overheads? So when we look at our total budgeted overheads, I think we had it as what? Overheads relating to what? Please give it to me. Relating to what?
Machine activity.
And that was 220,000 also. We have the one relating to production setups.
20,000.
That's setup cost, 20,000. Also, we had handling of what?
Orders.
Handling being 45,000 also. Okay, so when we put it together, these are total budgeted what? Overheads. You see the problem with traditional costing. Now, this total budgeted overheads we are seeing, you see each of these things have things that influence them, right? But under traditional costing, we put all of them together as one. Does that make sense to everyone? So we have 285,000, but they said this one, we are going to absorb it using what? Direct labor hours. So now what is the total labor hours for the period? Total labor hours. So this is our labor hours per unit times the number of units, right? Produced during the period. You get the idea. So total labor hours, we know that we have direct labor hours per unit for each of the products, and then how many units we produce, right? You can see it from the top here. So you are saying that if we take products, right? We take products L, we use how many labor hours? I want you to be giving me the figure so that it means you are following. How many labor hours were used for one unit?
5,000.
Of no, labor hours. How many labor
Just
hours were
one.
used?
One.
We use 1 hour. 1 hour per unit, right? For every one unit, we use 1 hour. But how many hours, how many units were produced? We produce 5,000 what?
5,000.
Units. If one be a 1 hour, then 5,000 will be what? 5,000 hours. It's not so. Okay. Now, if we come to product M, we were using what? 2 hours, not so, per unit. But we were what? In 7,000 what units, not so. So that is 14,000 what hours, not so. Now, if we put it together, we have 19,000 what hours, not so. Being our total what? Our total labor hours, not so. Okay. So now we can get our OAR used under traditional costing circumstance to be 285,000 Ghana cedis all over our 19,000 what labor hours, not so. And that gives us an OAR of how much?
15,000. Per labor hour.
Please, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in that case, now when we assign it to the product, let's get the total overhead cost. Now, if I want the cost, right? So the cost card, I'm just doing a portion of the cost card, right? So under production overheads, I know that production overheads will now be what? The production overheads, so product L, product M, right? So let's just see how it will go. We didn't bring material and labor because we don't have it, right? So in that case, production overheads, we have product L, no, so product L, the OAR is the same across board. So 15 per labor hour, right? 15 per hour. But how many hours were used for product L? I want it in total. You can also do it per unit. How many hours were used in total? So you go to your computation of the hours. This one we use 5,000 hours, right? So 15 per hour times 5,000 hours, not so, gives us the cost. So we have 15 by 5,000 hours. That means that this one will incur total cost of 75,000, right? When we come to product M, it's 15 cedis per hour, right? But we use what? We use 14,000 hours. You guys remember from our computation. So we have 15 by 14,000 hours. And that gives us what? 210,000 also. So this is from the traditional costing perspective, right? I hope everybody is okay. So traditional costing is not so deep. We absorb everything on the same basis. I hope that is okay. I hope that is fine. Yes. Now let's go to activity-based costing. So using ABC or activity-based costing, how do we go about it using ABC? So with ABC, what we need is this. To score marks with ABC, you need your cost driver rate or the OAR. And the OAR is what? The total cost in the cost pool. Do you remember? So total cost in cost pool all over what? The total number of what? The total number of cost drivers. Okay? The total cost in the cost pool over the total number of cost drivers. So in that case, for each activity, how many activities do we have? You take OAR for each of these activities, right? We don't put all the 285 together like we did. Do you get the idea? So in that case, let's see if we need OAR for machine activity, right? Do you guys get it? Then the OAR becomes what? Total machine activity cost, right? Over the total cost drivers for machine activity. Looking at all the information here, which one do you think will influence machine activity cost? Which one do you think will influence machine activity cost?
Machine hours per unit.
Machine hours per unit. But machine hours, machine activity cost was not in per unit, it was total, right? So we need total machine hours as well, right? So always be careful. If the thing is per unit, you need total. If you see this one, it wasn't per unit. This one wasn't per unit. If it's per unit, the question will tell you. Okay, so be careful. I see students multiplying by the number of units, even though it doesn't say per unit. So that means what do we need? So this one will be influenced by machine hours, right?
Yes, yes.
You get it? Yes. So in that case, let's go and get the machine hours. So let's get our total machine hours, right? So anytime it's in per unit, you have to work for it. So we have product L, not so L. How many machine hours were used? 3 hours were used, right? But how many units were produced? Is it not 5,000?
Yes.
So at the end of the day, the total machine hours for this product is going to be what? That is about 1,000 machine hours. Then for product M, we use what? 1 machine hour by 7,000 units produced, this one will end up with what? 7,000 what?
Machine hours.
Machine hours, right? So if we put it together, it means that we are going to get a total machine hour of what? Of 20,000 machine hours. Okay, so now if we should get OAR for machine activity, right? We have the total machine activity cost to be 220,000, right? So we divide it by the 22,000 machine hours that we have, right? And that gives us what? 10 CDs per machine what? Hour. Is it correct?
Please, can you recap on the total machine hours, how we arrived at the 22,000 machine hours?
Please check the data here. Machine hours was per unit. These are the units. So 3 hours per unit. How many units were produced? Is it not 5,000? Do you get it
Yes,
now?
please.
This
Yes.
use one hour. So how many units? Is it not 7,000? So 1
Yeah.
hour by 7,000, 3 hours by 5,000. The same we did for the labor hours when we were doing labor hours. You see, multiply this by 5,000, multiply this by 2,000 to get a total. Is it clear?
Okay. Yes, please. Thank
Okay.
you.
You're welcome. So now that we have 10 per hour, we try the other ones too, right? So you see, the examiner actually marks the formula. He actually marks the formula for each of the OAR. Students do not know. A lot of students will dive straight to the 220 over 22,000. They lose marks. For me, I told you, I teach you from the exam focus, right? How do you get it? So they mark the main one. So if you go to OAR for machine activity, you bring the formula for only that one before you start computing. Do you get the style? So if it's 10, you back 10 over 10. Makes sense. ABC is not difficult. I hope you are following gradually. Now, which is the next one? We need OAR for which one? Where's the next cost? Production setup, right? So we need OAR for setup cost, right? So that the formula becomes a total setup cost, right? Over what?
Setup cost in the period.
It's supposed to be the number of setups. I think it was a typo. So over the number of what? Setups, right? Number of setups in the period, right? So you write this, they mark it for you. So now the thing is, what was the total number of setups in the period? You see, it wasn't per unit. You see student multiplying. Did they say per unit? No. They said number of setups, right? So this one, you know, we have 10 setups plus what? 40 setups. That means we end up with 50 what? Setups during the period also. Okay. So in that case, my OAR for setup becomes what?
10
The
divided
total
by
cost was 20,000, right? Over what? 50 setups also. Not so. So that gives us what? 20,000 divided by 50 setups. That is 400 CDs per setup. Not so. So for every setup you make, it costs us 400 CDs in overheads, right? So you are done. You have put this down. Can we move? Can we move?
Sure.
So which is the next one?
Handling
Ordering
of
cost, right?
orders.
Handling of orders. So we'll call it ordering cost. So what's the OAR for ordering cost? OAR for ordering.
Total ordering. Total
Total ordering cost.
divided by the number of orders.
The number of orders handled, right? Yeah. Total of orders.
5,000 divided by 75.
Okay. So in that case, how many orders did we have? The number of orders?
15 plus 60.
15 plus 60, right? Giving us 75 orders handled, right? Okay. So in that case, what's the total ordering cost?
45,000.
45,000 divided by the 75 orders.
Divided by the 75,000, the 75 orders, right? And that gives us
600.
600.
That's 600 CDs
Mhm.
per order handled in the period, right? So now that you have this, you now need your cost card, right? So let's go and get our cost card using ABC. In somebody's background is quite noisy. Okay, so cost card using what? ABC, right? Okay, so in that case, I have product L. I have
Okay.
product L and I have product M, right? So we need to determine the cost card for each of the products. Do you understand? So what do we get for each of them? What do we get for each of them? So we get to production overheads, right? So production overheads, right? Production overheads. And then we have what? Products. We have the overheads are now broken into what? Machine activity, right? So machine activity. So you see before all the production overheads were one, but now you separate them into each individual. Machine activity for product L, we know the OAR was what? 10 CDs per machine hour, right? But how many hours were used? You go and check. Go to machine activity. Machine activity, we calculated it to be 15 hours and 7 hours. Do you remember? So now when we come here, this one is 10 CD per hour, but this one we use 15,000 watt hours, right? Do you remember from our computation? And then when we come to M, this one was what? It's still 10 CDs per hour from our OAR, but we use what? 7,000 hours. True or false? So this one gives us 150,000 and this one gives us 70,000. If you actually add it, you get back your 220. So you see, we split it enough. Then we come to setup, right? Then we come to setup costs. Setup cost to L. We realize that this was 400 per setup. Do you guys remember? But how many setups were made in the period? How many setups?
10.
Go with the number of setups in the period. How many setups did you get?
50.
50 setups.
10 for L.
We have 50 setups.
No, 50 is all together. This one we are doing L. We are doing
Oh.
for L. So it's for each product. So yes, it's 50 for all of them. 400 per setup. But L over L setup me is saying L setup was what? 10 in the period. This guy's setup was how much? 40 in the period. That's how we do it. Just like the way we multiply this by the number of hours and the number, that's how you go about it. Do you understand?
Mhm.
So 400 per setup by how many setups? This guy was 10 setups, Meboa.
Mhm.
So that gives us what? Is it not 4,000? If you come to M, how many setups? It's still 400 per setup from the OAR, right? But how many setups were made? Is it not 40 setups?
Yes.
So that gives us what? 16,000 Ghana cedis. If you add it, is it not 20,000? You can see from here. You get it. Then we come to the last one, handling costs, order handling, right? Order handling, what was it? I think we ended up with what? It was 600 per order, not so. But how many orders were made for L? Is it not 15 orders?
Yes.
Mhm.
When we come to M, it was still 600 per order. By how many orders?
60.
60 orders, right? Okay, so we multiply. That is 9,000 CDs. This one 600 by 60. That is 36,000. If you add 9,000 plus 36, don't you get 45,000? You still get. So this is the total sum, right? These are total costs. Okay, so these are total overhead costs for each of the products. And then if you add it up, you realize that we have this guy 150,000 plus 4,000 plus 9,000 That is 160,000. Then you have 70,000 plus 16,000 plus 36,000. And that is 122,000. Nothing. Okay. Now that you have this, assuming we wanted the cost per unit, what do? We divide each by the number of units, right? So if I want L, the cost per unit will now be this 163,000 divided by the number of units, which was 5,000 units produced. Do you guys remember? Because I want Bako cost 163,000 divided by 5,000. And that gives me what? 32 CD 60 pesos per unit, right? If I want that for M, I'm just going to take the 122,000 divided by the 7,000 watt units, right? That I have. And that's 122,000 divided by the 7,000. And that gives me 17 CDs, 43 pesos per unit. Okay. So I hope today's class was not bad. That brings us to the end of our session for today's class. Any questions?
Thursday we'll be looking at two questions, two solid questions.
Yeah, we'll look at one today in our next meeting, just as a recap for those who couldn't join. We'll solve one. You see, always I do a recap before we move on, just like I did. You see, today when we started, we looked at one traditional costing question before we started. So the next ABC question, we'll look at it. It is actually this question, a very huge one. This one, you see it, Shopper Limited. Okay, then I'll give you one as an assignment, which is this one, Triple Limited. Okay. Okay. So that is it. So have a blessed evening, and then I will see you on Thursday. Keep practicing. Make sure you all get the ICA study text, as I told you, because questions will be coming from there. I want you all to pass first attempt. But I hope today's session wasn't bad. You learned something small. Okay then. So I'll see
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.